We will continue to let folks settle into the space. I know we are right at the top of the hour, so to be mindful of everyone's time, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning again for those who may be joining us for the very first time. This is our ECHIA webinar learning series that we hold monthly. Happy New Year. Here we are in January. My name is Taylor Teichman. I am the Youth Development Coordinator for Pennsylvania's Education for Children and Youth Experiencing Homelessness program. And without further ado, it is my pleasure this morning to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Rajni Shankar-Brown. For those who may be meeting Dr. Rajni for the first time, Dr. Rajni is internationally recognized as an award-winning community engaged educator, scholar, artist, poet, author, and human rights activist. She is a professor and chair of social justice education at Stetson University in DeLand, Florida. So she is joining us from sunny Florida this morning. With over 3 decades of advocacy, Dr. Rajni has held leadership roles across nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and educational institutions. Her work has impacted communities globally with a focus on ending poverty, homelessness, and creating a more inclusive world. She has published extensively, presented worldwide, and is known for her commitment to trauma-informed social change and community healing. We are in for a treat on this chilly January morning. So thank you, Dr. Rajni, for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Taylor. You're amazing. So thank you for all you do, and to CSC and everybody who is here today on this very cold morning. Thank you for being here. It's interesting, even here in Florida right now, our temperatures have really dropped. We've had some pretty freezing temperatures overnight and really busy. Actually, up most of the night, we've been opening up heating and warming stations and shelters, emergency shelters for families and individuals and our children and youth. So thank you so much for making space and time and being here. Today, we are going to talk about poverty, homelessness, and endurance, recognizing and really preventing burnout, which is essential to all of the work that we do. And I opened this morning with the word love as a word to ground us this morning, as a word to manifest, as a word to remind us of what this work is truly about, and also to extend love and gratitude to each of you. The work that all of us are involved in, it is heavy work. And right now, as we sit here in January, I know so many of us are wearing a million hats, stretched quite thin, and we have so much work to do in our schools and in our communities. We are looking again at different numbers each year. You can look up our annual homelessness assessment report. It's called the AHAR online, and you can actually see, right, quite visibly, even with the numbers being understated, for those of us doing the work at the ground level, we can still see visibly how these numbers have continued to rise and grow, with families with children being one of the fastest growing segments. And in fact, over the past year, when we look from 23 to 24, and now we're starting to look at the data coming in from 25, very high growth across communities. In some communities, up to 39% increase with families and children. We are also seeing incredible disparities with our young adolescents and youth, overrepresentation in experiencing homelessness, living in poverty, and also our elders, people over the age of 65. And so we have a lot of work to do. And every day, thank you all for showing up and for doing this work across the state of Pennsylvania. It is, even as we gather today, and I look out in Zoom land at all of the names and the folks, such a beacon of hope and light, despite everything that is so heavy. So much gratitude. So I know for many of us at 10 o'clock, the morning has already been going and we are on our way with our to-do lists. For some folks, maybe the day is just starting, right? And you're rolling. And so no matter where you are, let's take a moment this morning to give ourselves the gift of a really good stretch and also a really nice inhale and exhale to allow our bodies to feel the beautiful joy of air and what it means when we practice prana and good breath and stretching and we give a little bit of love to our bodies, even just to take a few moments throughout our day to do this can have wonderful multitudinal benefits to our physiological, our mental and behavior health. And so we're going to take a moment, get comfortable, and you can just allow yourself. This is a nice stretch where you literally, if you're sitting at your desk, once in a while you can hunch those shoulders in, and then you can start to really extend your shoulders out. I sometimes even like what we call in yoga, the Surya pose, where we kind of reach our arms up to the sun, right, to kind of gather that light. And so you can give yourself a nice stretch. Oh, I even had a little pop there. Ah, and also, as you do this, just to inhale, exhale. Yeah, we hold a lot of tension in our body and sometimes don't even realize how much we're carrying. Where often our jaws are tight, we're holding this tension in our shoulders. We're working all day, kind of hunched at our desks or, rushing, rushing, rushing. And so being cognizant and giving ourselves a little bit of breaks in between, whether it's a simple stretch, whether it is a deep breath, can be a gift. And so remember that, right? And make that part of your day. So as we start off today, visuals are never perfect, but they allow us to ground ourselves and to start to think in different formats and ways. And when we think about poverty and homelessness, what we know is historically, we have focused a lot in communities and schools around the idea of equality. And we want everybody to have equal access and equal opportunities, especially our students, our families, our communities. But we also know the reality of growing social inequalities and disparities that we are seeing across the globe. But then here we can zoom in here in the United States and even in certain states where we're starting to see magnified disparities, Pennsylvania being one of those states. Florida, where I'm situated, being one of those states. And so what we know is, focusing just on equality is not going to work, right? Giving everybody just the same thing is not going to work because we all have these unique situations, historical context, so many factors and pieces when we talk about poverty, the complexities and the realities of poverty and homelessness. And so thinking about equity in our communities is allowing us to think about how do we individually, work in our communities to make sure people have what they need to not just survive, but to thrive. How do we start to build communities of love, inclusion, where everybody gets to fully participate and thrive? And we know we are also living at times where we are seeing and this is not, regardless of where we stand with political stance or different beliefs, because we're all very different, right? And have diverse viewpoints. But regardless of that, we can just look to numbers of what we're seeing with poverty and homelessness, even in our school districts, to see that disparities are widening. We are seeing historic highs of children and youth experiencing homelessness. And often, again, public survey is we have a lack of really public understanding, that children and youth are experiencing poverty and homelessness at such high rates and numbers. And in one of the hats I wear, I help chair equity and education for the National Coalition for the Homeless. And I'm the past president for our National Coalition for the Homeless, where we work with people with lived experience of homelessness. And we do a lot of different public and local, surveys and tours and try to get an understanding of what people's thoughts are and people's perceptions are. And we have a lot of stereotypes that we still have to work to break. Most of our public do not realize the number of children and youth that are struggling for fundamental human rights in our country, in our states, in our communities. And of course, all of us gathered here, we are doing the work, right? Every day, the heavy heart and hard work of rolling up our sleeves, opening our hearts, trying to work on resource sharing and allocations and education and all of the important roles that every one of you serves and shows up to do every day. And so I thank you, because it's not easy work. And as we start to see these disparities growing, the other thing we are seeing is in caregiving capacities and roles, people are also being asked to do more and more and more. Part of that is because the needs, right? And the social inequalities are growing. But also we have a lot of infrastructure shortages right now in the system. In school districts across the United States, we have many, many vacancies in lots of community nonprofits, and in many places and spaces. We are also seeing a time where even resources have been cut or are limited. And again, what does that mean? Right? Sometimes that means having less staff members. So those who are there are having to carry and take on more. Sometimes that means, okay, we may not have all the resources that we need. And so we're trying to shuffle and be innovative. But it's again, this expenditure, right, of energy and time and thought and heart, which is so needed and so valuable. But nonetheless, we also have to be cognizant of what that means. Right? What we often, even in psychology, they kind of talk about the toll, right, of caring. And it's a beautiful, needed toll in our world, and one that is most worthy, but one we also have to be cognizant of individually and collectively in order to sustain this important work in ways that are quite essential. And Mahatma Gandhi describes poverty as the worst form of violence. And I always think about it as layered violence because there's a lot of different layers to it. And one of the layers we often don't talk about is really the layer of even compassion fatigue, trauma, burnout, that folks who are also in caregiving capacities in doing this work often experience as well. Because often we don't have enough support structures and the investment, right? Really to care for the people who are also caring, doing the essential work. And so I'm grateful today we're centering and we're going to talk about burnout, and we're going to talk about ways to help address and prevent and think about with intention self and community care. So again, across states and communities, we're seeing growing encampments. Again, in our roles, that often means we're having to show up in a multitude of ways, physically, emotionally, cognitively. And we know that when we think about poverty and homelessness and even cycles that exist, there are a lot of different implications. And often, right, these adverse kinds of impacts and daunting realities that come with that is work that all of us are working also very hard at trying to combat and mitigate and make sure we're dismantling to build healthy, loving, just systems for our students. But so what do we see, right? When we see some of this, what does that look like and what do we see? Well, we know we can start to think about some of this in a deeper understanding and context. So one of those things that we know is we start to see higher social and emotional impacts. So often we can think about higher ACEs, right? With poverty and homelessness, adverse childhood experiences. We know that when poverty is there, we see an increase in ACEs, and we've seen this study after study, right? Research that really is about people and human lives. Physical health challenges, increased physical health challenges, right, is a reality that we see. Also, we start to see social and emotional impacts, right? Social and emotional impacts, mental health challenges, behavior health challenges, acute and chronic stressors that become very real. We start to see, less likely in terms of graduation rates, something that all of us are working very actively to combat, right? Because we want our students to stay in school to be able to have successful journeys of life. Higher risk of unemployment, connections with incarceration. So, in addition to being an educator, teaching in higher education, and also working in community engagement, I also teach in local prisons. And we see, right, across juvenile justice centers to incarceration centers, we see that poverty and homelessness often is this common thread in the stories and lives of the students I teach. And with all of this, there is also increased trauma. So for anyone who has experienced, lived in poverty, experienced homelessness, whether it was brief or even longer episodes, chronic, situational, trauma is very, very real. When you've had to weather the weather, you think about right now with these freezing temperatures and trying to survive, trying to figure out where to shower before you go to school so you're not bullied and made fun of, trying to make sure you have food because it is hard if we don't have our physiological needs met. It is hard to do anything else. It doesn't matter how rich and dynamic our curriculum in school is. It doesn't matter, all of these other pieces we can put into place. If those physiological needs are not met, it is very, very hard, right? As we know through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to actually start to reach that potential and to start to bring those other pieces into to focus. And love and security and belonging are also a big part of this work. Now, the other piece of this is when we have talked often about poverty and homelessness, and this is kind of larger in the field of education, in the field even of social work and counseling, often we have not focused a lot on what does it mean for educators, counselors, social workers, homeless liaisons, youth service providers, folks in nonprofits. What does that look like when we talk about the poverty cycle and homelessness in terms of that connection and relationship? And what we know is now we are seeing quite visibly increased compassion fatigue, increased stress and stressors, and many times prolonged stress, and often stress that we are so used to just packing away and pushing aside and not even paying attention to because we're just trying to keep going, right? Vicarious and secondary trauma, which also for some of us who have experienced poverty and homelessness can also trigger our own traumas, right? So that we have to be cognizant of that as well. And the point of what we call secondary trauma. This is some interesting research I've been really wrestling with and doing lately, is looking at even what we call secondary and vicarious trauma, at what point that really moves into trauma itself, right, for an individual. And so these layers we can think of. And then burnout, which is very connected and very real to all of this. And so it's a lot to think about. And a lot of times, I'm so grateful we have this space to even pause and to remind ourselves and to pay attention to all of this, because it's very easy to kind of not think about it because we're so busy. Our to-do lists are so long. Everything that is in our work is urgent and important and demanding and calls on us. But if we don't take care of ourselves, if we burn out, we're not going to be of help to anyone, right? In fact, we can even be of injury unintentionally in the workspaces that we are in. So when we think about professional trauma and fatigue, often we hear about compassion fatigue, stress, burnout, vicarious trauma. And one of the things that we need to realize under this kind of umbrella is each of these things have their distinct characteristics, definitions, conceptualizations, but they are also all very interconnected, very much interwoven, right? Compassion fatigue often leads directly to burnout. Often, right, vicarious trauma, stressors are connected and lead to burnout. So all of these things exist, not in silos, but are in fact interwoven and connected in very real ways. And we know that when we think about poverty and homelessness for our students, our families, and us doing this work, we may be experiencing, right? And I say this collectively, even what we're starting to see as generational mental and behavior health challenges. Right now, research, right? We're doing studies and we are living at a time where we have intense, high anxiety, depression, mental and behavior health challenges that are skyrocketing across the board. And I would say magnified, especially for our young adolescents and for caregivers, folks who are in caregiving capacities, right? And we can look to, the American Mental Health Institute. You can look to, our medical science studies that are coming out that are starting to finally kind of shed some light on this. But yet we don't often publicly talk about this enough and pay attention to it. So compassion fatigue, there are many definitions that exist in the world. One we can think about is being defined as the emotional residue of exposure of working with people, right? Suffering from the consequences of traumatic events and experiences. Sometimes we will hear compassion fatigue also interchanged with vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress. Again, all of these have their distinctions, and we only have so much time today, so we can't get into all of that. But I definitely encourage everyone, as you have time to explore, right, some of those nuances. But the main thing we want to understand again is these interconnections that we see. And the word trauma itself comes from the Greek word wound. And while originally we thought about wounds in terms of physical nature, we now know the social emotional wounds are also very real and they are very connected to physical as well. Our social emotional connects to our physical and physiological selves. Again, a book, some of you who've been part of our Replenish series might remember me bringing up the book, The Body Keeps Score, right? So, our bodies, how trauma impacts us shows up in very physical ways, all the way from cardiac issues to sometimes we see, even now they're making links to stress and cancer. Right? Stress being very real, playing a part in all of these different ways in our physical health as well, just like physical health challenges can impact our social emotional. So while sometimes we talk about things with such distinct kind of silos, the reality is it's very intersectional. So if we were to kind of keep going and think about compassion fatigue, some of the things I want to highlight today is compassion fatigue often comes from caring deeply, right, about others, and it's over time. It's often cumulative. So for all of us, we are in this work every single day, right? This is the work we have chosen to do. We care about deeply, right? At least I can speak for most of us. We're probably not doing this for income, but outcome. Although income is important, and that's a whole talk for another day where we've got to keep advocating, right? Because we need a fair living wage in this work and are essential in this work. But what we know is over time, right? As we're doing this, even in the course of a day, a week, a month, a year, years, we start to absorb and carry. And it's like thinking about if we're going to walk into an ocean or a river, we can't expect to be walking into it and not expect to be wet. And even if every day you leave the river, the reality is you're soaked, right? Your clothes are soaked for a while. And if they don't have ample time to dry and you walk right back into that river again, your clothes are constantly going to be soaked, right? Or damp or wet. And so we can start to think about that. That's kind of an analogy or visual for us. And it can coexist with or lead to burnout. And it is not a lack of care. Sometimes folks hear compassion fatigue and they see that as, oh, fatigue with compassion, they don't care, right? They're cold, they have compassion fatigue. It's actually the very opposite. It is often a sign that we care so deeply and have cared for so long in ways, but we've extended that care without sufficient replenishment, without sufficient healing or refuel. And over time, right, what does that look like? What does that mean? And that's really important for us to think about. So, symptoms of compassion fatigue, right? Again, compassion fatigue being the cumulative physical, emotional, psychological effects of exposure to traumatic stories, events, when we are working in helping capacities, combined with, and this is really important, this last part, combined with the strain and stress of everyday life. And why I kind of emphasize that is we are living again at very, very complex times where we are seeing in our world some of the largest humanitarian crises we've ever had, where for everybody everywhere, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, are coming back and saying, we are living at highly, highly stressful times. We are information overloaded. Everywhere you look, right, there are growing issues all around us. And even if we're not thinking about it, we are absorbing, whether it's through the news, whether it's through social media, all of these things that are circulating. And strain and stress is very real. And for many of us in caregiving capacities, here's the other thing, right? We often talk about poverty and homelessness in many contexts within the educational realm without also acknowledging that so many of us also doing this work ourselves may have financial challenges. So in the state of Florida, we have so many educators, social workers, counselors who themselves are on food stamps, relying on SNAP's benefits because we don't have a fair living wage, because the cost of rent and housing has increased exponentially, right? So there's these really complex, layered types of things for us to think about when we talk about compassion fatigue and burnout. And so what does this mean? Okay, emotional, physical exhaustion, overwhelming feelings, sadness, guilt, right? The guilt. I don't know how many of us have, I often feel like I'm not doing enough. And if I take a break, oh my gosh, I'm not getting to this. And I know it's so important. And this family needs this and this child needs, for me, it leads to insomnia, right? Where it can also lead to somebody where all you want to do is sleep, right? Where you crash on Friday, you don't wake up till Monday, right? And you're still tired. So it shows up differently for different folks. And we want to pay attention to this for ourselves. It can affect dimensions of our well-being in many ways: nervous system arousal, sleep disturbances. It can reduce our sense of efficacy on a job. Emotional intensity can increase. Cognitive ability decreases, where if we are having days where all of a sudden, I know I just put my coffee somewhere. Where was it? Oh my gosh, I just had my keys. I just had that paper. I just signed it. What did I do? And we're having a lot of that, right? The cognitive lapses are very real and actually connected to this. Behavior, judgment impairment, isolation, where, sometimes we pour so much into our work that outside we have very little energy to show up. So, you say social life, what is that? Right? Some of us is, what is that? Right? So we may just, or even what happens is the guilt of, okay, I come home and now I'm so tired, I don't have enough time to give to my family. Or I extend myself and I'm giving at work and giving to family and I completely forget about myself. Right. And this is a reality for many in our work, right? Line of work. Depression, it might be frequent headaches where sometimes you're having migraines or headaches, and we are just treating it with Advil or Tylenol or thinking we just get migraines. But really, again, coming back to start to examine the roots is really important. And we don't often do that. Right? Even medicinally, if you think about a lot of doctor's visits, a lot of times we just treat the symptom very quickly as opposed to asking some of those deeper questions that take time. It takes time and energy, right, to ask. Gastrointestinal issues, very real when we're stressed. Workaholism. That is also a sign where sometimes we are just work, 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 work. And that can be a way too. It actually can be a sign of trauma where you're kind of avoiding in some ways trauma, but constantly doing work. It's a very interesting juxtaposed thing. PTSD, different types of addictions. It can show up as self-medicating or substance challenges, overeating, undereating, right? All of these things. Loss of self-worth, anger, reduced sympathy or empathy, where we're just kind of depleted, depersonalization, apathy, intense pessimism, problems in our personal relationships, where it might show up, whether it's with colleagues, it might show up at home with our spouse, our partner, our loved ones, friends, and some of the emotions can be short. Because we're so exhausted that we end up unintentionally even snapping, right? Or saying something or not having the patience to really show up and listen to somebody. And that can harm a relationship, right? Which can be hard to repair. So I look at this and I kind of want us to pause for a moment, and you can use the chat box. And if you're willing to kind of share, have you experienced any of these kinds of symptoms? You can just say yes, no. You can list what you're dealing with, whether it's sleep disturbances, but take a moment to reflect for yourself. When you think about even the last week or month, what's showing up for you, right? Yeah, and of course we had winter break, so maybe some are feeling more fueled, but for many of us, the work still continued, right? Yeah, I see a lot of yeses, a lot of yeses. Yeah, capital yes. Yep. Yeah, stress. Yeah, poor eating, sleep. A lot of them sleep disturbances. Yeah, migraines. Yeah, gastrointestinal challenges. Absolutely, definitely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, wow. Yeah. And Brenda says, I've been doing social work for almost 30 years and I'm just feeling it now. So that cumulative, right? And all of a sudden it can really show up in ways. Sleep disturbances, tension. Yeah. 100%. I'm so tired when I get home, right? Yeah. Headaches. These are all so real. And we are finding, right, again, doing these medical studies, and they're really interesting. What we're finding, is for so many of us, we actually operate well below depletion in terms of energy and tension being so high, but we train ourselves to exist where that becomes so normalized in our work. Right. So even when we have just like a little moment of a breather, or we're like, oh, this is wonderful, we're doing great. But we're actually carrying and packing so much that we train ourselves to just kind of go through and how do we cope with to be able to function. But the problem with that is so often for so many, eventually that is not sustainable. And it shows up and can show up whether that's health, physiological harms to the body. Um, you know, uh, Again, we're looking at educators and folks in educational roles working in caregiving capacities having higher heart attacks, higher strokes, right? And I'm not saying this to scare all of us, but the cognizance of we don't sometimes talk about this in our professions. And our systems don't often put in intentionally systems of care for all of us, right? So in a way, we're called upon where we've got to help advocate for each other and ourselves in terms of our social, emotional, physical health, especially so we can continue this important work. Very, very real, right? So thank you all for taking a moment to share and reflect there. And so if we start to think about burnout, right, we can think about burnout as a state of emotional, physical, mental strain and exhaustion, often caused by excessive and prolonged stress. And burnout can be described as a cumulative process. It may be associated with various factors. That could be increased workload, where we're taking on more and more and more, institutional stress, the trauma of within our jobs, a combination, right, of all of these factors. And burnout looks differently for different folks, right? Where right now we actually have such burnout. So even I'm going to take the profession of teaching in our high poverty schools, for instance. We are seeing burnout at the highest levels where teacher turnover is so high, which is leading to so many vacancies where some districts have not had enough adults to even show up in the building to the point where they've had to call in the National Guards to show up. It is really, really pretty terrifying times, right? But burnout being so high is what we're seeing across the board. And so what does that mean, right? And then the folks who are still staying in their capacities, if folks are leaving at such high rates, that often means taking on more and more and more, which can also add to burnout. So there's it's almost like dominoes, right? All of these factors impacting each other in very real ways. And something I want to highlight is when we talk about burnout, burnout is not usually caused by a single factor, right? Now, it doesn't mean we can't feel depleted on a certain day or week because something happens, right? We all have days where in a day we can feel burned out that day. But when we talk about burnout in more of this kind of wider, larger sense, it is often because of prolonged or chronic, unresolved stress, which often is the very nature of the work all of us are in, right? Especially in caregiving work and capacities, because there is a lot of stress in the nature of the work we do. And so what becomes important is for us to start to ask the question of how do we start to address and even find ways to proactively prevent? We're not going to be able to fully ever prevent stress in our line of work or even in life, right? The lives that we live today as humans. But there are things, we all have agency that we cannot forget about to do things, whether simple or even start to build in more systems of care that can help us to prevent and to address stress in healthy ways. And so I often, I think in visuals. And for me, again, the moksha, the nesting doll, it comes up over and over again for me as an analogy for so many things. Something that my amma, even as she experienced poverty in her own life, was gifted by a dear friend. And something that I loved playing with when I was young, right? Getting and opening each of them till you get to the baby core of a doll. And now as an adult, I keep my moksha nesting dolls close by, but I think of this as all of us as humans, our students, ourselves, even you can think about it from a community sense, where we see things from the outside, but every single one of us is carrying layers and layers of experiences, stories, traumas, joys, right? All of this inside of us. So often in our caregiving roles, we ourselves don't take time to open up and to go in and to really ask the deeper questions of how are we doing, right? Even you think about how often as humans in the passing, whether it's at work or in our community, we've become so accustomed to, oh, how are you? I'm fine. How are you? Oh, that's going. I'm hanging, right? We just answer very fast and it becomes so routine. And often we don't really take the time to sit with the question and to really say, how am I? Right? How are you? And when we ask the question, even to know that is an important, pretty loaded question, right? That actually, if we want an honest answer, requires time to sift through, to reflect, to do a little bit of that cognitive and heart work to really respond and answer. And so when we ask our students, how are you? Hopefully, right? So often we are reminding ourselves to practice that active listening. We need to apply that same to ourselves, right? To ask ourselves, how are we? And to be willing to give ourselves time to listen and to dig in and to hear what that response might be. And to pay attention to the signs, right? What are we feeling emotionally? Day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, right? Kind of collectively, individually, what are we feeling? What are we, experiencing cognitively, physically, behaviorally, right? What does that look like for us? And these questions are important to ask of each other, community care, to ask of ourselves. And I think about a fuel tank, and one of the techniques that I will give you this tip, right? I think about how in a car, often our fuel tanks are designed in such a way we have some kind of indicator telling us when we are approaching or on empty. You may have a light that shows up on your fuel gauge, and so you know, oh my gosh, I'm out of gas. I need to get to a gas station. I need to refuel, or I'm below the half, right? I need to refuel. Well, as humans, we often do not have that. We don't have this kind of magic sound that goes up, da-da-da, or a light that buzzes all of a sudden. And again, the reality for so many of us is we are operating well below the empty. And it is so normalized for us that even when we get to empty, we think, oh, we're feeling good, right? But actually, that's pretty dangerous. So we want to sometimes check in with ourselves. Do a fuel check every day with yourselves and remind yourselves, to do this. You can put a literal reminder in your phone, right? Where you say, I'm going to remind myself to check in twice a day just to say, how am I? And at that moment, right, am I doing okay? Great. Then continue with your day. Do I need a moment to take a moment to stretch or breathe? Or maybe even if it means pausing that long, hectic to-do list, taking a moment to go make yourself a cup of tea and slow down, or taking a moment to just go outside for a minute and take a fresh breath of air, right, and come right back into work. Whatever that is you need. And then you also want to ask the question of what are larger systematic things I can build into my life? And it is not easy. It is so hard to make time to do these things. And we live in a society where we are often made to feel guilty to take time for ourselves, right? Or we're just so stretched. It's like, I don't have time. I don't have time to go take a walk or exercise, or I don't have time to. I love, maybe you love baking, but you're like, I would love to bake, but I don't have time. I only have time when over winter break to make cookies, right? But I love it. It makes me joyful, happy. Well, here's the reality. Often when we tell ourselves we don't have time, that is when we need to make the time the most, right? Where we need it the most. And so we want to ask ourselves systematically, how are we building in systems of care for ourselves as well, right? And what are we doing to refuel? And I know I don't want to call out my dear friend Taylor, but she inspires me because she makes time, right? Even as busy as she is as a mom, as a working professional, she takes time to do her exercise in the morning. Even before today, she went on her swim, right? And she's a swimmer. And that's important. And what it allows her to essentially do is show up better in her work because she's making that time and she's doing something that's larger infrastructure. Because if we're getting to Friday and all we want to do is Netflix and eat a box of chocolate and drink a big bottle of wine, that can be fun sometimes, but that is not sustainable, right? It's not healthy in the long run. So we need to have healthy things that we're building in with intention. And we can start small. If we don't have a lot of time, maybe it's saying I'm going to incorporate some breathing practices every day into my schedule. Maybe it's, once a week, I'm going to take a little break and buy myself a coloring book in the new year and keep some colored pencils and just do a little bit of coloring. Things that we often did as children, including play, can be very healthy. We stop doing them as adults, and it makes no sense. Why? Right? Well, it makes sense because we run out of time. We're busy. But we actually still need those things to nurture ourselves, to replenish ourselves, to heal, to show up refueled in all of the ways we show up in our communities, in our schools, in our homes, to show up for ourselves. We want to think about mind, body, spirit when we think about refueling. Sometimes some of us are better in one way than another, right? And I'm guilty of this. I'm not very good with the physical, the exercise, right? I'm being open here and I need to do better, right? And again, here we are in January and I'm telling myself I need to do better, right? Where I may be better in pouring in myself creatively or mentally, right? And so we want to go back and say to ourselves, going back to this, how are we with intention, even if they're small movements, thinking about everything, right? Mind, our body, our spirit, because that holistic wellness matters as well. If we're just pouring in one area but neglecting other areas, that can still have impacts for us and show up in our lives. And so think about all of these different ways of self-care and also think about broadening it to community care. And sometimes self-care is as simple as saying, I'm going to slow down, right? And that can be, that can take a lot of courage sometimes in a system or a day where, it is very normalized to be busy. And if we are slowing down, that means we may not be getting to something and we may be, made to feel guilty. But sometimes that is what we need. It's important. It may be, igniting our curiosity, right? Asking questions about things. Thinking about what brings you joy. What brings you joy? If you haven't asked yourself that recently, what is it? Maybe take up a new hobby just for fun. Maybe it's just, laughing, with a friend and making a commitment as we come into the new year to say, as busy as I am, I'm going to have a regular coffee date with a good friend where we're just going to put work aside and talk and or share about work. That can be very healthy therapy, right? But making that a commitment. So figure out what works for you. And we have to think about support as well as we think about all of the ways we need to fuel ourselves and be good to ourselves. And of course, we can't pour from an empty cup. So how are we keeping that cup fueled and filled with intention and care and love? And at its core, self-care is about processing emotions It is also about reconnecting with ourselves. And that takes time. It takes time. It takes energy. Often why we don't do it. And sometimes it can be scary to kind of open up. Even the question of how are you? That's a hard question sometimes because we can be very afraid of if we open that gate, right? And we're really honest, what's really going to come out, right? And sometimes I know, even for me, right, there's triggers in the work and having, as somebody who, as a youth, had a lot of intersectional trauma, some of that trauma, even though a lifetime of working on healing and all of this, it still shows up, right? And is there in ways. But yet, taking the time to recognize that is also the way we can start to heal and we can also start to prevent burning out, right? Prevent harms, adverse harms. So I want to ask the question to all of us this January, this spring, as soon we're going to move from winter into spring. How do or will you refuel? And also the word consistently, right? It can't just be, it's not saying that a really good bubble bath is good once in a while. That can be wonderful. But are you doing it consistent? If it helps you, right? Maybe make that part of your routine. It's not just a luxury treat once in a while, right? What does refueling look like to you? And how are you going to do it? And it can be one small thing that you're going to start with, but name it, identify it, write it down, right? Hold yourself accountable, share it with the loved ones so they check in with you to say, hey, right? Did you go on your walk today? Or, did you read a good book over the weekend and take some time to digital detox, right? Whatever that is you're setting for yourself, share it with somebody who can also help you to remind you it's important and to remind you not to feel guilty about it because it is quite essential. And think about all of the different dimensions of well-being. There are many, many dimensions. You can find from 5-dimension visuals and models all the way to 9 to 12 dimensions. Here we're looking at 7 dimensions that are often quite critical to well-being: mental, relationships, physical, cultural, environmental, occupational, financial, right? This can be really, really important, right? And think about how are you going to kind of invest and pour into that dimension of well-being, and what are the dimensions that you want to focus on? Sometimes we can't focus on everything. We have limited capacity and energy, and that is very real. So we also want to think about what are the dimensions that are really important to us, and that can fluctuate and change during our journey of life. And so one of the things we want to do is take time regularly to even check in with ourselves about the dimensions themselves. Where are we? How are we doing? What do we need at that moment in our journey and life to focus on? How are we going to focus on it? If we say that we're not doing as well in an area, right? Like I shared, okay, physical, I need to do better. It's not enough to just recognize that. We want to then go a step further to say, well, what are we going to do? What is some action planning and goal setting that I'm going to do? And what's realistic? Right? If time is a factor, maybe I don't have an hour every day to do exercise. Well, you know what? What is it that I can do? Maybe it is 15 minutes. I'm going to do some deep stretching. Maybe, at least I'll start twice a week with getting some good cardio in, whatever is doable, right? So we can make it realistic and we can build starting small if big feels too overwhelming. So, revisit, evaluate, and talk to each other, right? Even in our community of care, reach out for support if needed. Self-care, especially in the work that we do, is a priority and a necessity. It is not a luxury, especially in the work, the critical work that all of us are doing. Work that is so needed, direly needed in our world. Think about unity and community. So in Sanskrit, we have the saying, when you replace I in illness with we, W-E, it becomes wellness. And I love that, right? Because community is important. Having support systems are important. We know this for our children, our youth, right? We try to actively, hopefully, cultivate that for our families, our children, all, our students that we're working with. We need that too, all of us, right? So, how are we going to remember the collective community care? And to remember that healing does not mean trauma never existed. It doesn't mean trauma no longer even controls our lives. But what it does mean is that we are working actively and with intention and love to address trauma, to prevent future trauma, to address burnout, to prevent future burnout. And if we are burned out, right? The other thing is if we are burned out, it doesn't mean we have to stay burned out. There are ways to burn back in. Oh, yeah, baby. We can burn into this work too, right? And we can be called into this work in ways, but we have to do that with intention. And that takes energy and time and care and love and a lot of thought, right? A lot of thought. Marian Wright Edelman, founder of the Children's Defense Fund, says the question is not whether we can afford to invest in every child. It is whether we can afford not to. And these are words that have often grounded as I think about and do the work with children and youth. But I now, right, in this part of my journey, and working with so many amazing educators and educational youth service providers, liaisons and social workers and counselors like all of you, I ask the question as well. The question is not whether we can afford to invest in every caregiver. It is whether we can afford not to. And I'm going to say we can't, we have got to invest in ourselves and each other so we can continue to do the work to show up for our children and youth and families, our schools and communities. So as we're closing out today, I love art, and the arts quite literally have saved my life, in my own journey. And I look to the arts for a lot of healing and hope, and am an artist myself. And this is a mural that I fell in love with. It's in Los Angeles by an artist named Chavalis, and I love it when you're up close. It looks like a mosaic. It's all broken, almost like shards of glass. And you don't really see the image till you step back. The reminder that sometimes in this work, we also have to take a moment to step back, to pause like we're doing today. I'm sure all of us have a million things on our agenda, but we made time today to show up. And that's awesome, right? We need time and space like this. So in this image, Chavalis says a vital call for healing, a swift motion to cleanse. And in my photograph here, I've snipped off a little bit of the bottom in my slide, but it says the word community. Community. And I ground us today as we end to take love, community, self and community care, to think and hold these things with intention in the new year, in the work that all of us are doing, and to remember, right, that every ripple of goodness we do can become waves of change, and to not forget to pour those ripples of goodness back into yourself, because it only makes the ocean stronger. Thank you for being you. Thank you to the Center for Schools and Communities. Namaste. And if you all have questions or need me, I haven't been able to keep up completely with the chat. So I'm going to definitely ask Taylor to send me the chat and I will respond. And if I can ever be of any hope, my help in any way, right? Our hope in any way, reach out. My email is there and I'm always happy to help.
Yay. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajni. We'll definitely send you the chat. You were getting some good feedback and just wanted to uplift some of the ideas that folks were sharing in the chat. So someone said they kind of do like a mental review of the ways they've been helpful and
Yeah,
then like kind of as the like a nice closeout to their day. So just kind of wanted to uplift that was a really great idea for like integrating that into a daily practice.
I love
Um,
that. I love that. Yeah, even a gratitude journal, right, can be
yes.
wonderful because even when we're stressed and have all these things that are going wrong in our day or just, things that are heavy and hard, to remember, even something we have access to clean water. Today, I'm going to say
Yeah.
I'm grateful for that, right? And that can help with our perspective. And yeah, so simple things can go a long way as well with practices.
Yeah. I'm just dropping in the chat for folks who might still be hanging on. Dr. Rajni will be with us again next month, February 11th at 10 a.m. So you can head over to the link to register. She'll be with us for a final session. We've been so lucky. We've had Dr. Rajni for the last 3 months in our series. So make sure to definitely join us in February. And I know a few folks who are grabbing the evaluation link. I know it was requiring you to log into your account, similar to when you had to log into register through the CSIU. Once you log in, you should be able to click on that evaluation link again, and it'll open up the actual evaluation for you. So apologies that there's kind of a little extra step there. So we appreciate you still getting in there and completing those evaluations for us. And we will hopefully see you again in 3 weeks in February then. Wishing everyone a lovely rest of your Wednesday. And we will see you all again very soon. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajni.
Oh, thank you, Taylor. Someone just wrote in the chat very quickly. They completed the eval, but there's not a submit button.
Oh my goodness. Okay, let's see here. Well, I will. Okay, so what we will do as part of follow up, I'll send an email out to folks. I'm going to connect with Mike, who is our very helpful tech support. So I'm going to connect with him and then we'll send that eval link out to everyone here later today. So you have that.
Yeah, I don't know if you can
Okay.
hear me. It's mine. It's Kirsten Idris. I go to the end,
Okay.
and the last question is what professional develop opportunities, and then there's nothing at the bottom to submit. It just has a log out button. So I was like,
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Thank you for letting us know.
yep.
Mike is going to help us take a look at that and we'll resend that link out for everyone so folks
Okay,
can
thank
make sure
you.
that they submit that. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for
Thank
letting
you
us
for
know.
sharing that.
Yeah,
Well,
always
everybody
important to have
take
that.
take care of yourselves and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye all.